What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another video. Today, I'm excited to talk to you about a super sweet Tyranid list that I found when I was trolling through competitive 40k lists from this past weekend. This list is truly insane for a Tyranid list, so let's go ahead and dive right in. We're over here in Best Coast Pairings tournament listings, and we can find the list over here on the Grim Dark Grand Tournament page. This was the #1 placing list from Hogan Franklin, who played Highfleet Gorgon. This is pretty interesting because Highfleet Gorgon was a fairly popular Tyranid Highfleet, at least theoretically, when the Arcs of Omen format came out. It can do a lot of mortal wounds in addition to normal damage. It has poison attacks, both melee and ranged, which makes it good at dealing with high toughness, non-vehicle targets. So let's see exactly what's in this list. We can go ahead and click here to take a look at the list. This list is bringing an Adeptus Custodes detachment coming out of the Solar Watch subfaction. It's being led by Trajan Valoris, who is the Warlord, to grant his bonus command point, as well as a couple of Alaris Custodians, 3 units of Custodian Wardens, 2 of 10, 1 of 3, and 2 Vexillus Praetors. A Vexilla Magnifica to reduce attack rolls coming in against those Warden squads, and a Vexilla Imperius to give them +1 attack and improve their damage output. Honestly, it's a lot of really interesting technology to bring into a Tyranid list from Highfleet Gorgon. In fact, I'm wondering why I've never thought of bringing any of these units.
Wait a minute!
It's almost like this is an Adeptus Custodes list. But honestly, we're poking a little bit of fun here, but this is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine within the competitive community. And it's an interesting discussion. When you register for an event in Best Coast Pairings, which hosts, I would say, probably the majority of competitive 40k events around the world, it asks you to input your army's faction and in some cases a subfaction. Now, exactly what constitutes an army's faction has always kind of been nebulous. It's not a mechanic that actually gets used in the 40k proper. Your army doesn't have a faction. It has a selected group of keywords that all work together synergistically per the army building restrictions that are listed in your codex. So the game doesn't care what you consider your faction to be, but what does care are faction rankings and statistics. Especially in event circuits like the ITC, where best in faction placements are actually worth some prize support. There are a lot of players who, instead of going through the grind of constantly switching factions and trying to be ahead of the metagame to be the #1 in ITC or highly placed, they instead play a single faction and try to get as many wins as they can with that faction. That makes the competition a little bit less fierce, but more interesting, and allows you to compete and still be rewarded for your event results without having to play the top thing and without having to buy new armies. That, honestly, I think is awesome. The downside is that because a lot of this data is coming from Best Coast Pairings, it's not a great way to police mistakes like this one where the incorrect subfaction is input into a list. And it can happen pretty easily by accident. Either you just misclick on the faction that you want, or if you don't input a faction, it actually goes to the top faction in the list, which is, I believe, Adepta Sororitas. So there's certainly some Adepta Sororitas scores being reported for people who just didn't put a faction in. Now, this also becomes problematic because we know that a lot of the statistics that not only the community and commentators like myself are looking at, but also the Games Workshop design team who are making balanced decisions based on these competitive play events are relying on sources like Best Coast Pairings. And so if we do have these erroneous faction results get put through, it can actually impact how the design team approaches the balance of the game. With tens of thousands of lists being submitted on a regular basis, it's basically impossible to vet every single one of them. Now, the other question about exactly what your faction keyword is, and especially now we're in a format with allies and things like that, has always been nebulous. In Arcs of Omen, it's actually much easier. I think that the best practice would just be to go with whatever faction keyword you have selected for your Arcs of Omen detachment specifically. It used to be like you had to take matching keywords for all of your detachments. The rationale I enjoyed most was that your army keyword would be the most narrow of faction keywords that you'd selected for that army. So, for example, if you had a bunch of Imperium detachments, you would be an Imperium army. But if all of those detachments were Space Marines, you wouldn't be an Adeptus Astartes army. And if all those Space Marines happen to be Dark Angels, you would be a Dark Angels army. Some other ways of doing it would be to go with whatever faction your Warlord is from, or whichever faction the majority of your army is built around. But now that we're in Arcs of Omen, the game only really cares about what faction your Arcs of Omen detachment is from. That determines what allied detachments you can take and your secondary objectives, and I think that's the easiest one. That's not really the question here. In this case, a different faction was input for an Adeptus Custodes list, and I just think that's unfortunate. For the people who care a lot about faction rankings, it does them a disservice to jump in and put in a different faction, even if it's for a joke. A lot of people do it as kind of an inside joke, which doesn't really make sense, and in some cases it can throw off the statistics and results, and especially for factions that have a low play rate initially. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything like malice in this particular instance. It's probably just a misclick or a mistype, and you're on your phone and your fingers are too big, but I do think it's something to pay attention to. So when you're reporting your list for an event, just make sure your faction's correct. I don't know. I think that's about it. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this issue and whether you think that there's a solution or whether you think it even matters at all and whether we should care. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Thanks everyone who supports as well over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all you people are great. And with that, remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming. Let's be honest, like there's a bias here. I noticed because it's a Tyranid list.